Okay, guys, we're going to continue our lesson on the Soviet Union and the United States today. Please make sure that you're continuing with your note session that we started last class with the invasion of the Soviet Union. Hopefully you got some good information about the siege at Stalingrad, the Battle of Moscow, and definitely the Battle of Stalingrad at this point as we were figuring out what was going on in the Soviet Union. Now, once we figure out that Hitler invaded the Soviet Union eventually in 1941. Now we can look back to the Americans and see what we're doing, and this is what's going on. So the first place we actually go to in World War II is Africa. In 1942, we're going to get introduced to three men here from the start today. We're going to get introduced to the very famous American general. His name is General George Patton. You might have heard of him. We've already got introduced to Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox there in the middle. And our first time we're gonna get introduced to Bernard Montgomery, the general that was in charge of the British forces and the tank units there in North Africa. Okay, so the first place the United States are going to land in North Africa. And let's check this out on a map. All right, now here's our map that we had the other day, and we're going to actually look at the blue arrows today. So what I need for you to do is I need for you to find Spain on this map, and you see the blue arrows right there. South of Spain, and that are arriving on shore in North Africa. Notice the year there, 1942. 1942. Now that blue arrow and those landings there in North Africa represent tank divisions of the Americans. That is General George Patton coming to shore there in Algeria in 1942. Now, if you go right across east on the map and you look at Egypt, you can see that there was a very famous battle that you learned about for your quiz the other day called El Alamein. Now, Bernard Montgomery, the guy that we just saw a second ago, was the leader of the tank divisions of Britain and is going to win a very, very famous battle that had two battles there in Egypt called El Alamein. Now, the blue arrow that is going away from Egypt is basically the British chasing the Germans back towards Central Africa, okay? So if you continue to watch those blue arrows by 1942 into 1943, you can see that the British and the Americans are basically sandwiching the Germans right out of North Africa. Now follow the blue arrows. Now those blue arrows go through Sicily, where there's some great fighting we'll learn about in World War II. Now at this point, you're going to have egos coming into play. The ego of George Patton and the ego of Bernard Montgomery. Now these two men respected each other, but they really didn't like each other. And they wanted to claim the glory of chasing the Germans right out of Africa and so on. So the blue arrow that you see from the north central part of Africa there, going there to Sicily, just imagine these two armies racing to each other to get the Germans out of Sicily. You can see that the blue arrows by 1943 are continuing, and just imagine that the American and the British forces are chasing the Germans and the Italians out of southern Italy and so on, up to 1944, and then back into Germany by 1945, okay? So that's what we're talking about. Now, the Allied troops there in Italy from 1942 to 1943, for a long time, Winston Churchill said that if we wanted to attack the Axis power controlled Europe, we got to do it from the south. Now, he called Italy the soft underbelly of the Axis, and it proved true. And his thought and his phrase for the bottom part, or the southern part of Axis-controlled Europe, actually came to fruition because the American and the British forces moved the Germans out of North Africa, into Sicily, into Italy, and then obviously out of Italy by 1945, when the war is going to come to an end. Now, in 1943, as the Americans and as the British were coming to shore, Italy actually overthrows Mussolini. The Italians are going to dissolve the fascist party and actually declare war on Germany. So you Italians in the crowd, you're going to flip sides once again at the towards the middle there of World War II, just like you did in World War I, okay? Now, Mussolini has a great story. About a year and a half later, in 1945, he was looking to escape the city of Milan in Italy with a mistress, with a group of Italian fascists that he was with, when they were stopped by a few communists, members of the Communist Party in Italy. And one member of this Communist Party that stopped this crew trying to leave Milan in Italy noticed a person that was not Mussolini He noticed that he was a member of the fascist party, stopped him, questioned him, and found out that Mussolini was in that crowd. Now, there was talk about what they should do with Mussolini, but in the end, there's some very famous pictures of Mussolini, which is hanging in a suburban center, a plaza in Milan. He's hanging upside down. He died by a firing squad, and they hanged him upside down, and people began to stick knives in him, throw rocks at him, beat him up again while he was even dead. The picture to the left, you can see members of the fascist party. So you can see that the fascist party is officially over as far as those famous events in 1945 in the city of Milan, Italy. Now, the Americans are also aiding at this time in a little direct and indirect battle called the Battle of Atlantic. Now, this battle between Allied ships and German U-boats that carries over from World War I is going to intensify during World War II. This is a fantastic map that shows you in blue is the outline that basically encloses the areas where merchant ships, Allied ships, were sunk by German U-boats. Now, look just off the coast of the United States. This is a little bit scary, all right? Just off of our coast in Fort Lauderdale, there were U-boats just off the coast of Jacksonville, off of New York City. There's declassified information where German U-boat commanders were like, they were looking right at the Statue of Liberty, pointing their U-boats right at the Statue of Liberty, which is kind of scary to think about. Now, the red circles indicate where U-boats were basically assessed and probably sunk, okay? So you can see that just off the coast of New York in the red circle, that's where the submarines were sunk. Obviously, as you get closer and in the middle, the big red circles represent a lot of U-boats being sunk by Allied ships and so on. Remember, the blue lines are the, basically tells you, indicates where the sinkings were the heaviest, where German U-boats did the most damage. Off the coast of West Africa, and then obviously off the coast of Western Europe is where they did their most damage. But you can see also there's some U-boats that sunk ships off the coast of Florida and so on, okay? So this is a real good map that basically shows you the Battle of the Atlantic that the Americans were involved in as well. Now, in 1939, at the start of World War II, sonar was improved. So just as radar, which shows planes that helped the Battle of Britain and the British during that time to pick out German planes. In 1939, sonar was improved. Sonar is what you use to hear sounds underwater. So that really helped the Allies to detect the German U-boats. And now, as the German U-boats were very effective, all right, in World War II, as the war went along, we were able to find them a lot easier and destroy them and make our path into Europe, if we were to ever to get there, hint, hint, a little more easy to get there. Now, I don't have to talk too much about the Battle of the Pacific. You know that from the time that Pearl Harbor hit all the way to 1945 throughout the war, we're fighting in the Battle of the Pacific. We're going from island to island in our island hopping campaign. You guys have done a great job with that with your Pacific Wars battles presentations, so we don't have to talk about it too much, but we just have to mention there that remember that while this is going on in Europe, the Americans are still doing their thing in the Pacific. Now, by 1942, as the Americans are coming to shore in North Africa and fighting the Germans and take battles and get ready to go into Italy. Now, Stalin is going to make a very, very famous demand in history. Now, last class we talked about the invasion of the Soviet Union, and we talked about the pressure that was on Leningrad, the pressure that was on Moscow, and the famous battle of Stalingrad. Well, by 1942, Stalin has had enough, and he is going to make a huge plea to the Allied powers, to the Western democracies. He told them and he pleaded with them to please open up another battlefront somewhere in Europe so that the German forces would have to focus and fight a two-front war once again. In 1943, as Leningrad is under siege, as Moscow, the people and the civilians are getting pounded, and Stalingrad is starting, he demands that the Allied powers open up another battlefront. Well, as those cities in Russia are going to continue to suffer, Stalin's demand is actually going to come to fruition on June 6th, 1944. And it's going to happen in a very famous event in American military history and military history in general called D-Day. Now, many of you have heard of D-Day, but you might not know where it fits into history and you might not know the specifics about it. Well, we're going to spend a couple class periods talking about it because it's one of the most iconic moments in American military history and Allied military history for that matter. Now, you always, in popular culture, D-Day, usually you call it Doomsday. But the letter before day just represents the way that the American military named operations. So there was an A Day, there was a B Day, there was a C Day, but there was no operation that had a letter in front of it that was larger than D-Day. So it's going to happen on June 6, 1944, and basically what it's going to be is the Allied invasion of Europe through northern France, okay? So the Allied forces, and we're talking the Americans, we're talking the British, we're talking the Canadians by now, are formulating a plan from England to cross the English Channel and invade northern France. Now, the name of that was Operation Overlord and Operation Neptune. Now, Neptune is the Roman god of the sea. So this was going to be an American-led, one of the largest amphibious assault in the history of our world. Now, amphibious is a term that we learned during the Japanese Pacific campaign, and it's when you attack from water to land, okay? So that's what this is going to be about. Now, the goal was to fight through northern France and to liberate Paris, okay? But the biggest problem that's going to happen here is that, remember, the Germans have been in France since 1940, and there is an absolute defensive wall on the northern border of France. All the way from Belgium, all the way through France, the Germans had dug in for years and years and years to prepare for a possible invasion. Now, if that invasion were going to happen, everyone knew that it was probably going to happen through northern France, but they didn't exactly just know where, okay? And that's what D-Day was all about. Now, the Germans thought that landing was going to happen at the city of Calais, okay? So the Germans thought and were preparing for the landing that was going to happen at Calais. Now, the person that Hitler had put in charge of defending the northern border of France, the northern area of France, and defending that, was Erwin Rommel. Now, by this time, he had been kicked out of North Africa. He'd been chased through Sicily. He'd been chased through Italy. And when he came back to Germany, Hitler put him in charge of defending the northern French coast. So this was Erwin Rommel that was in charge of defending this. So the Allies were going to have a tough time getting through the coast. Now, the reason why the Germans thought the landing was going to happen in Calais is for a really good story in world history class. Now, if you look at this map, you can see in France, okay, you see where France is. Now, you can see where Paris is, so take a second and look at it. Now, find Belgium on the map, and then right to the left, right west of the word Belgium on the map, is a little city there called Calais, C-A-L-A-I-S. And notice that it is the closest point between England and France. Now, in Calais, the Germans had spies, and they were witnessing something that was going on across the English Channel. Now, across the English Channel, right there on the coast of England, there was a new military base being built by the English. Now, what the English did, and it's brilliant, they took British set designers, people that designed movie sets for British movies, and they literally created a phony base, a fake base. Way before D-Day even happened, they were building this base, and they erected barracks out of wood. They actually took old PVC pipe, and they created a fake oil refinery. They even went to the extent of making inflatable Jeeps and set them up all over this base and had people coming in and going out at all hours of the day. Now, German spies were reporting back to Hitler that, oh man, something's going to happen here right across from Calais, and we really think that it's going to come from this military base, okay? Well, that didn't happen. It didn't happen. And on June 6, 1944, the beaches of Normandy, directly in north-central France, farther west of Calais, is where this amphibious assault is going to happen. Now, the assault had two steps, and step one was very fascinating to me, and you guys usually love this story, and you don't know much about it. My 11-year-old, Caden, loves this story. He learned about it in school, thank God, and he really, really likes this moment. Now, step one was 6 hours before the amphibious assault on the beaches of Normandy were going to happen. At midnight of June 6, 1944, there was going to be an air assault behind enemy lines where 13,000 American paratroopers from the 101st Airborne Division were going to be dropped behind the northern French border in Normandy. Now remember, the French coast, northern French coast, is a defensive wall, crawling with Germans, crawling with guns, crawling with tanks, crawling with armor, crawling with divisions of German troops. Now, 13,000 paratroopers were supposed to be dropped behind enemy lines at midnight, 6 hours before the overall big assault was going to come to shore. Now, the goal of these paratroopers were to take out the big guns that were positioned and facing the beaches that were going to pound the soldiers that were going to come to shore. And here's the problem. Well, it was a great idea, and you can see in the image there, you can see President Eisenhower getting the troops ready, like you saw in the video before, like you're going to see actually in a video after this. Their goal was to do that, but there were problems with this. D-Day almost happened a couple days before, but Eisenhower had to call it off because of bad weather. June 6, 1944, they got the call. Now, the paratroopers all had maps, and the planes were all supposed to drop the paratroopers in designated areas. But there was a problem. Number one, the weather was too bad. Still bad. Number two, the German anti-aircraft defenses, meaning the German guns that were trying to shoot the planes down, were a little bit overwhelming and not expected to the extent that they were. So because of that, you can see where the paratroopers are in the plane in the image right there. Now, they would all hook up to a line at the top. They would be looking at two lights at the end of the plane where the door is to exit, where they'd be jumping out of. There'd be a red light and there'd be a green light. When the red light came on, they would hook up and they would get ready to jump. When the pilot would hit the green light, that means they were over their designated area, and that's when they were supposed to jump. So all the soldiers had maps. A lot of them had maps. A lot of them had been studying about the things around it, what their goals were, and where they were supposed to be dropped. But here's the problem. When they actually got into France, all right, the Germans were trying to shoot our planes down, and a lot of pilots panicked. And many pilots, as their planes were being shot at, hit the buttons too early. So there's American paratroopers that were dropped way far from their specific drop zones. I'm talking 20, 30, 40, 50 miles away from where they were supposed to be dropped. And you had 13,000 paratroopers basically running around northern France, not knowing where the heck they were, not getting back into their divisions. Now at the bottom, of my slide here, the last thing we'll talk about today, that is of the 13,000 paratroopers, after 24 hours, after being dropped into France, there was only 4,500 of those 13,000 paratroopers that were where they were supposed to be, that were back in their divisions. The rest of them were crawling around northern France trying to hide from the Germans, and it makes for a very, very intriguing story, and that's what we're going to talk about for the rest of class. Now, the next class that we have, we're going to talk about step 2, and that's going to be the amphibious landings. All right, that's when we're going to storm the beach at Normandy 6 hours after the paratroopers were dropped behind enemy lines in northern France to try to clear out the Germans and try to clear out their big guns. Okay, so we're going to stop here for the day. I have a lot of videos. Come back to me, and we're going to talk about bringing this to life, and we're actually going to watch the paratroopers jumping into northern France and hearing a little bit more about their story.